Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Smith and Sheridan podcast on the business and science of biotechnology. So I'm Cormac Sheridan and I'm joined by Andy Smith. Hello, Andy.
Hello, Cormac. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Today we're going to talk about what you have called the skinny jabs. These are drugs that have a history of use going back more than a decade and a half, almost 2 decades in diabetes care. But more recently, following additional clinical development work on the behalf of their manufacturers, some of them are now as well being used for managing weight and obesity, and have also shown some extremely promising signals in large outcomes trials that their ability to help people reduce weight also converts into very substantial improvements in reducing the risk of cardiovascular events such as heart attack, stroke, and even death. So there's an awful lot to sort of welcome about these products, but there are caveats too. And also, it seems that they are propelling a wave of hype in the pharmaceutical industry. You're probably closer to the markets than I am. Maybe talk me through who are the main players here and what has the success that they've achieved in this area done for them?
It's very interesting, Cormac, that you say the main players, because if we go back to more than a decade, the main players weren't the two who are the main players today. They weren't Novo Nordisk and they weren't Eli Lilly and Company. They were originally a biotech company called Amylin Pharmaceuticals that was acquired by AstraZeneca and Bristol Myers Squibb, and they had the first approved GLP-1 agonist, Byetta, and then Byetta LAR. So they had a lead on the market. And then the next generation came up with Novo Nordisk, who are still there with their two branded versions of semaglutide for a treatment of type 2 diabetes and obesity. But what's startling is that, and sometimes, as an observer of the biotech market, you think that best drug gets discovered first. More often, it's not the case. And this is one of those more often cases where the best drug, the head start that AstraZeneca and BMS had in the GLP-1s, they were left standing and they are left and they are nowhere. And then the two, Lilly and Novo Nordisk, now seem to be dominating the market for the moment. And with 40 odd % of Americans being overweight or at least obese, that's going to be a very large market. And it has led, along with the celebrity endorsements and the clinical studies that you talk about, that yes, you can help type 2 diabetics control their blood sugar. And yes, you can get obese patients with a risk of cardiovascular disease or with cardiovascular disease have a longer mortality. The improvements they've done in that period, both in the peptide design and the delivery, have been head and shoulders above the original Byetta and move those two companies now to the head of the queue, what looks to be a very big market, not just in diabetes, but then obesity, and then possibly in the prevention of non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. And I've even seen people talk about Alzheimer's as well. It's becoming the panacea. And with those celebrity endorsements and people saying they've taken them and it works, comes that hype. And it's interesting to know, when do people say that hype's gone too far? As you say, sell-side analysts have been talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of these products. And then at the other side, there are payers saying, no, we just can't afford it. And at the moment, some of them aren't affording it because if you're a Medicare patient, that Medicare doesn't cover weight loss and obesity. And I imagine a lot of the commercial players in the US are saying, yeah, well, that's very interesting, but come back in 3 months after you've shown a failed diet and exercise, and then we'll talk about, a prescription for a GLP-1 agonist then. So lots of different facets coming into play. Yes, it's a large market. Yes, there are real benefits to diabetic and obese patients, but it's looking very expensive at the moment. A few years ago, when the antibodies for Alzheimer's disease started to come closer to approval, there was Medicare up in arms saying, oh, no, we can't afford the budget for those. And the price came down on those. And as we see over time, we'll see GLP-1s. There'll be more than two competitors in the field. We'll probably see orals coming through from Amgen and Pfizer. And in the same way as we saw with hepatitis C, that competition, hopefully, and that competition for payers' dollars will bring down the costs, hopefully, over time.
Although, the pharmaceutical industry has never been particularly characterized by price competition, has it? Prices tend to go up rather than down.
You don't launch a drug at your lowest price, obviously. And if you're the first one to the market, then these drugs aren't the largest market for these drugs are in the US. You launch at the highest price that the market will stand. And that market depends on how many competitors there are and the price of the drug and effectively the clinical effectiveness and the safety. So when you take all those together and you get more entrants coming in, then you will get competition. And this is what payers contracting organizations or payers contracting departments are there for. They're there, as they did with hepatitis C, they're there to play one off against another and say, look, we'll give you this big contract, but not at that price.
It does raise the question as well, purely if you're looking at the pricing issue. Semaglutide, the Novo Nordisk molecule, is available under 3 different brands that I could find, at least: Ozempic, Rybelsus, as well as Wegovy. And there are different dose levels. Wegovy is indicated for obesity. The other 2 are indicated for type 2 diabetes, and they're much, much lower doses. But it's interesting to note that Ozempic, the original of the species, as it were, was approved as far back as 2017. So it's had 6 years in the market. I didn't check before I came on the call with you when its patent expires, its composition of patent expires, but the primary patent, presumably, it must long predate 2017. Typically, the disclosures are made before a drug actually enters clinical trials. So it's some time yet ahead of us. But because these are peptide drugs, they are readily converted into generic products when the patent regime permits. That will take some heat out of it, at least. And I could see a situation arising over time where you're taking larger amounts of low-dose semaglutide as a way around if there are formulation patents that protect Wegovy. It almost brings to mind the issue regarding the use of Lucentis versus low-dose
Avastin,
diluted Avastin in ophthalmic disease. It's just a thought, but it strikes me as being a very odd, almost perverse situation in some instances where some people being fed diets of low-quality junk food that's very cheap then require a drug regimen that costs $1,000 a month or more. And there's something quite perverse about that, I think.
Oh, there's more perversity in the drug market than you even hinting at that. But there are aspects to the patent life on these drugs, because Ozempic and the oral version of semaglutide, which you mentioned, Rybelsus, they've been improved over time. And actually, the first generation, Victoza, was the Novo Nordisk GLP-1.
That's a different molecule, though. That's liraglutide, right?
Yeah, liraglutide. So the same molecules have, and as what I said earlier, the same molecules have improved in both in terms of their peptide structure, which results in better efficacy, and in terms of their longevity in the body on circulation. So you can expect at some point there will be biosimilar GLP-1s. But I also found it quite quaint, Cormac, that someone who's observed the biotech sector for so long can believe that alone will bring down the price of these sort of drugs. I mean, we've had biosimilar insulins in the US for years, and still insurance companies push their patients onto the higher dose ones. And it's only taken an act of government in the Inflation Reduction Act to actually bring the price down to a price cap. So it takes more than just and we know that the problems of penetration of biosimilars in the US are there just because payers can dictate which ones are on formulary and which ones aren't. And the biosimilar ones typically don't get. I mean, we've seen Humira biosimilars launch this year and be virtually unknown in the market, which contrasts Europe, where we've had biosimilar Humira or adalimumab anti-inflammatory indications for a number of years. And Europe, because Europe is largely a group of single payer markets, they've embraced biosimilars like no other market has done. And they've even thrown the hurdle of, is it substitutable with the branded version or not, out the window. That's still playable in the US. But in Europe, they say, no, all biosimilars, because they've been registered as a biosimilar to the branded drug, then that's the same. So we might expect, when we get wider use of these GLP-1s in Europe, we might see some sort of that penetration of a biosimilar versions. But I wouldn't hold my breath for that happening in the US anytime soon.
Would you have any concerns from a public health perspective if millions of people are taking these drugs, that low level but very serious health consequences might flow. There is a black box warning for a certain rare form of cancer associated with the use of these drugs, certainly in rodents. That's been reported. I don't think any such cases have been reported in humans yet, but we're still at very early stages. I think it's some form of a thyroid cancer. Is it inevitable that people who will take these drugs will have a raised risk and some will be unfortunate enough to actually develop these cancers as a result of taking these drugs, do you think?
In its broadest aspects, that's a fact of life in drug development, right? Because when you do a clinical trial, it's with a group of patients who are quite tightly defined. And when the drugs get out there in a wider patient population, you never know, they've not been through exclusion or inclusion criteria as much as you would do in a clinical trial. They have to correspond to the labeled indication. But a much more heterogeneous group of patients. And over time, as we saw, even with things, and the classic case now in recent times is the mRNA vaccines, right? I mean, they were never dosed in the billions of patients. We had to get the billions of patients to actually see signals in pericarditis and other aspects that would never really have seen in clinical trials. So yes, the GLP-1, already there have been reports of suicide ideation and other aspects that have increased the label. This will happen when drugs get dosed to wider real-world populations. I think if we were seeing something fatal in a high level, and you and I remember the Tysabri example where something was approved, accelerated approval, admittedly by the FDA, but then had to be taken off the market because of a fatal infection associated with its use. I think if we would have seen that by now, enough patients have been dosed with the GLP-1. So we won't expect anything dramatic, but we'll see the labels evolve over time. I'm not sure whether someone, as you were hinting earlier, who really wants to lose weight, who is clinically obese, will be put off by, they probably have suicide ideation anyway. So I think safe, effective in most of the populations used, that the safety won't be a limiting factor in their use going forward.
And it goes without saying that, obviously, I think we should acknowledge that not everybody who suffers from obesity has suicidal ideation. I don't think they're necessarily linked. But at the same time, obviously, obesity is a very serious condition with many, many complications, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and cancer, to name just three. And there are many, many more, as well as sometimes there can be obviously fairly major implications in terms of lifestyle and sense of well-being. I look at these drugs too, though. You look at the FDA labels for these drugs and say, Wegovy, for example, just to read them out. The most common adverse events include nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, constipation, abdominal pain, headache, fatigue, indigestion, dizziness, abdominal distension, eructation, which is a fancy word for belching, low blood sugar in people who have diabetes, flatulence, gastroenteritis, and gastroesophageal reflux disease, which itself is quite a risky condition itself. That's a fairly heavy toll. It doesn't mean if you take the drug, you're going to get every single one, or you're going to get every single one every single time. But it's interesting that people's desire to lose weight, when it's not a medical necessity or a medical imperative, especially when it's taken more as a sort of a lifestyle drug or for sort of cosmetic purposes, that people will be willing to tolerate some or all of these adverse events. Do you think that the hype is going to lead people to take the drug and then maybe regret taking it, or can they just simply stop taking it and revert to their previous status? I'm just curious to know how much of this has been driven by hype and by sort of people's desire to look well rather than by a medical requirement or necessity.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is driven by hype. I saw a report a couple of weeks ago based in New York City, a highly urban center, where it said just over half of the patients who've been prescribed the GLP-1s had a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. Okay, so there will be some obese patients who are clinically obese who need those patients. Yeah, and you've hinted that there are some really good medical reasons why patients who are clinically obese need to be treated in order to prevent the costs and keep them economically active. But I'm sure the other half of patients in New York City who aren't type 2 diabetics, who are actually getting these drugs at the moment off label, they perhaps shouldn't be doing it. And we haven't mentioned yet that there are supply constraints, that the hype has moved on to the fact that, and these are recombinant proteins, right? These are recombinant sterile proteins that are self-injected. It's not the same thing as a small molecule to get that in the hands of millions of patients. So, supply constraints have restricted supply. And even more than that, we've had patients who shouldn't be on it for type 2 diabetes getting the drug and possibly even denying those type 2 diabetic patients their treatment to control their blood glucose. I mean, we talked about obesity, having healthcare ramifications. A type 2 diabetic not getting their GLP-1 agonist also has healthcare implications as well. So lots of moving and perhaps even antagonistic components to what's evolving in the GLP-1 space at the moment. I don't think I answered your question though.
Yeah, well, you kind of did. And also then, I mean, I'm just seeing how one of the investment banks, Jefferies, put out a very comprehensive report last week, which even got pick up in the media, snappily titled "Way to Go: Assessing the Wider Implications of a Slimmer Society." Way spelled WEIGH.
Right.
And a revolution 20 years in the making, a designer drug, healthier choices leading to healthier fundamentals. They're even saying that this is going to impact all sorts of other sectors, airlines, restaurants. They're going to make more money because the passengers they'll be carrying will be lighter. The restaurants, certain industries will be impacted negatively. They're looking at these massive kind of ramifications of this drug maybe being one of those things that you'll ultimately take with your cornflakes, except for the fact that currently they're injectables for the most part. Is this just excess nonsense? Is this statins have become sort of embedded in the lifestyles of many, many people, and they've become generic, and so nobody talks about them anymore because they're not making massive profits for the branded manufacturers. Is this just more of the sort of the same sort of hype that we had with statins whenever it was 10 or 12 years ago? Is this drug going to be a revolution in public health, or these drugs, this drug class, I should say? Or is it just going to be your typical sort of, the pejorative way of saying it is a smash and grab by the pharmaceutical industry, but that's not fair. I mean, these are drugs that have a good evidence base behind them that are doing good things for people with obesity and type 2 diabetes. But the notion that somebody who's a half a stone overweight needs this drug too, that's a problem. And is everybody going to be kind of grabbing these drugs? And I know I'm asking you to predict the future. I suppose I'm trying to understand the dynamic here.
Yeah.
Will the pharmaceutical industry behave responsibly around this, or will they pretend to be responsible while sort of raking in the dollars?
I think the reputation of the pharmaceutical industry it rose dramatically during the pandemic and has fallen off since then. So whatever they do from here on in on the GLP-1s, risks their reputation. I'm sure they're aware of that. But thankfully, it's not just the marketing dudes in a pharmaceutical company like I used to be who determine what happens in the market. There are governments and there are payers these days that can put a stop to that, but can modulate, if you like, the launch and the commercial use of these drugs. And these are serious drugs. I'm not saying the statins aren't serious drugs, but these are serious drugs which in the wrong hands and even in the right hands can lead to a lack of tolerability. You mentioned that nausea being the most common side effect. And when I first started looking at the first GLP-1 Byetta all those years ago, it was the most common side effect, nausea. And I thought, oh, right, well, that's simple. I can think of a lot of cheaper ways of making myself feel sick than an injectable protein that would help me lose weight. Nausea is a side effect of a lot of other oral drugs. And that never really happened. And it certainly didn't happen in the second generation of obesity drugs that never really took off, because what patients wanted at that time was they wanted a drug that would treat their weight, but they also wanted to carry on and eat as much as they had as normally. And you can't really do those two and have an efficacious drug. The drug won't work. And it certainly is the case. And this is where the GLP-1s have moved along, because yes, there's an element of nausea, and that stops you going out and eating a lot. But also I've seen reports of higher brain functions with the GLP-1s that actually reduce the reward mechanism in the brain. So as well as stopping you wanting to go out and eat a lot, it might stop you going out and drinking a lot, right? My wife would applaud that sort of thing. And also for patients who have opioid use disorder, it might help them as well. So there are higher brain functions. That's why I say that these are serious drugs. And in the wrong hands, just because, as you said, Cormac, if you wanted to lose a few pounds, that's not the sort of indication you want for that sort of drug that affects both mood and reward centers, as well as gastrointestinal function and glucose metabolism. I mean, you really want some sort of sensibility, if you like, approach. And you might say that the pharmaceutical industry doesn't do that. I think it will eventually. And the fact that they are high cost drugs will actually encourage that, if not by the pharmaceutical industry, but by politicians and by payers. I also saw an article, actually a couple of research notes from a couple of investment banks last week, who were saying at the moment Medicare in the US for the government, the federal plan for seniors, doesn't reimburse drugs for weight loss because they regard it as a lifestyle indication. I think that's where we can draw that delineation between weight loss and obesity. For someone who is clinically obese, the health ramifications are very poor and they need to be treated. For someone, as you say, is a couple of pounds overweight, that's not a candidate for a GLP-1 agonist. And so I can sort of see Medicare's rationale for saying, no, we won't reimburse these. But a couple of analysts at investment banks, who I won't name, last week actually said, oh, no, that'll be gone soon. There'll be so much political pressure that Medicare will reimburse it. Well, Medicare has a budget, right? And they have to pay for it. And they're not just going to willy-nilly cover these things at any cost possible.
Yeah. And in terms, just to bring back that point about cognitive function, how seriously are they being regarded in terms of having potential in Alzheimer's?
Yeah, I think that's very early stage, and I've only seen a few apocryphal reports about it, and it probably related to some mouse model somewhere. And I don't know about you, Cormac, but if I want to rely on mouse models of brain function, I'd like to think, although again, my wife will probably disagree with me, that my brain function is a bit more complicated than that of a mouse. And I did actually know a main board director at AstraZeneca who was in the oncology area, who, it's really easy to cure mice of cancer. He used to say to me, Andy, mice lie and people die. So we could be basing on the GLP-1 use in Alzheimer's on some sort of n=5 mouse model that doesn't have any relation to human brain function.
Yes, so it's early days. In NASH, which was, again, an indication which received an awful lot of hype and investment from the industry in recent years, and then seems to have gone off the boil because there hasn't been a huge amount of progress made in that area, as far as I can see. How seriously are these being taken there? And I don't even fully understand as well what's at play in terms of mechanism.
I mean, that is another serious indication, right, NASH, because the ultimate outcome of NASH is death, liver failure, transplants, or death. And going back earlier in the patient's journey, some of the prerequisites for non-alcoholic steatohepatitis or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease are obesity and diabetics. So theoretically, you'd think that if you have a drug, the GLP-1s, that effectively treat obesity and diabetes, or prevent obesity and treat diabetes, then they might have a knock-on effect over a number of years in preventing NASH.
So it's preventive, or does it deal with NASH as it extant in a patient right now?
No, and the reason why a couple of reasons why you say that NASH has been quite a tough indication is because the FDA requires a number of endpoints to determine whether a patient is clean. And even, I don't know if they still do, but they used to actually require a liver biopsy, not just one, but multiple liver biopsies to show that fibrosis is reversed and the symptoms of NASH have also reversed. And that's quite difficult, to persuade patients into a clinical study to do that if there's a 50% chance of them being on a placebo, but also to have a number of liver biopsies at various points during the clinical study is a pretty hard ask as well. And then if you've got a drug that prevents NASH, doesn't actually treat it at the moment, but prevents it in the long term, okay, you want to treat it in patients who are diabetic and obese and have a cardiovascular risk factor. And how many years do you need to treat that for? So I know the clinical trials people are rubbing their hands at the moment, thinking, CROs are thinking, wow, that's a really expensive study. Let's start pitching it to Lilly and Novo. And it will be, hundreds of millions of dollars to do that. But it may actually have utility at the end of the day. But it's still, again, like Alzheimer's, not so much like Alzheimer's disease, but it's too early to tell whether that's going to result in a result.
And so it's obvious, though, that the success of these drugs is going to instigate a huge amount of activity, both in terms of looking at potential additional indications, but also looking at a population level as these drugs go into much larger populations of people, just running through the safety consequences of that and looking for signals where they might be causing harm, or they also might be causing additional benefits. Who knows? As well, just as we talked mainly about, obviously, for good reason, Novo Nordisk and Lilly, another of the also-rans back in the day was Sanofi, which partnered with Zealand Pharma, which was a Danish company that always had quite a good expertise in terms of engineering peptides. And you mentioned that Amgen and Pfizer are both kind of lining up to enter the market. I'm assuming, given that these have now been, as in industry parlance, commercially validated, this is going to become a huge space for new market entrants.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there are as yet unheard of biotech companies who are going to go around to investors in a few weeks' time with a potential GLP-1 agonist that's oral and safer and does other things. But yes, I mean, it's not going to be a two-company market. There are orals coming already in phase 2 with Amgen and Pfizer and Structure Biotechnology, other companies anyway. And that competition in of itself will bring down the pricing and make the market much easier. But still, at the same case, we don't know what the side effect profile of the oral GLP-1 inhibitors are yet. So we've no idea whether it's better or worse or whether they're as efficacious. And as you say, there have been GLP-1s that have passed off into history in the hands of Sanofi, Zealand, and AstraZeneca and BMS. So that there won't all be winners. And again, another facet of the global pharmaceutical market is not everyone can be winners. There are winners and losers, and we just don't know. It's too early for us to tell. We know who they are this year. It's obviously Lilly and Novo. We don't know who they'll be in 3 to 5 years' time.
And of course, another point I should have raised earlier, Lilly's product Mounjaro, or tirzepatide, to give it its generic name, is not only a GLP-1 agonist, it's also a GIP agonist, a glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide analog. That dual mechanism, it does seem to convert into a stronger weight loss signal, it seems to me. Is there anything more to it than that?
No, I mean, it's one drug by a slightly different mechanism can give you one effect, but two drugs by slightly different mechanisms will probably have if not synergistic, but an additive effect. So we saw that in Lilly's next generation GLP-1, GIP, and also I think it's Novo who are looking at the combination of GLP-1 and another hormone, amylin, which is the name of the company we were first talking about first. So the final treatment rationale for type 2 diabetes, which is strange, right? I mean, we've had patients treated with human extracted insulin, animal insulin, and now recombinant human insulin for decades. And the rationale for the final treatment for type 2 diabetic patients with whatever hormones and proteins in addition to insulin is still evolving after all these years. And you get hats off to Lilly and Novo and the other companies who are investing in GLP-1s and other hormones to actually move that treatment rationale along. And again, it's for the same reason as you would want to treat a patient who is morbidly obese, because they live longer if you help them with that obesity. They are economically more productive if you treat them. So it's great, right? I mean, we were talking about the reputation of the pharmaceutical industry before, and now they're helping to save the world in some respects, if you can afford it, I think is what you would add.
Yes, as is always, that caveat always applies. But at the same time, I mean, I've seen reports that these drugs signal the end of obesity, the end of type 2 diabetes. I don't think so, do you?
I don't think so, but I also think it's as you were saying, there are vested interests. Where did this thing about you have to have 3 meals a day come from? Yeah, and counting that now is we have the GLP-1 agonists that actually stop you wanting 3 meals a day. So yeah, there's a yin and yang there in terms of pull, but it's obviously a lot cheaper to go out and get a McDonald's Big Mac, other manufacturers' hamburgers available, than it is to self-inject yourself with Manjaro or Zepide.
And of course, we did evolve in highly calorie restricted environments as a species. For most of us, that is no longer the case. Although, let it be said, in this time of food banks and poor quality of food, that fundamental need isn't maybe adequately addressed. And arguably, one of the contributory factors to the situation now that we have in the pharmaceutical industry. But that's not the pharmaceutical industry's direct responsibility, I suppose. It's just a factor of the world we inhabit and how it's structured.
Yeah, and it's also part of human evolution. I mean, you know that cartoon that starts off at one end on the left-hand side of an ape, and moving to a Neanderthal which walks upright, to modern humans that are hunter-gatherer, and then going through today's humans that have a bit more of a fatty out. Yes, exactly. Well, I'm now thinking that the far right-hand side of that cartoon is someone who's still thin. Again, it's a hunter-gatherer profile, but he's also injecting a GLP-1 agonist in his.
Yes, well, maybe that's the future that faces all of us, and it's probably as good an incentive for getting out on the bike or getting out the running shoes.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, stay safe, and we will be talking again. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, Cormac.